So I would say two things about the after theatricality part of this, then I'll quickly introduce our panelists. The after theatricality part is really, we had a certain sense of the debates around theatricality in the art world, and that is what it means to have a relation to an audience, and what it means to deny that relation to an audience. And for myself, for me, just listening this morning especially, but also a bit this afternoon, when the discussion of the public, I realized that one of the issues that I would describe around the aesthetics of anti-theatricality is precisely the way in which the attempt to, in effect, deny a certain relation to the beholder is an effort to problematize the relation one has to an audience, but in part precisely to imagine replacing that relation to an audience with a relation to a public, in which the public and the audience would need to be distinguished. In fact, however, in sort of putting this panel together, what we had were, in a way, and this goes back to the panel just before, more aesthetic concerns. I'll say something about Todd, then I'll explain the aesthetics. So Todd is an associate professor at Emory. He is sad that he can't be here today. That's his book, Effective Formalism. He's got a new book on architecture coming out. This is a little plug for the journal that many of us are involved on. There'll be a bunch of us here, but a bunch of us also at Princeton and University of Chicago and places around the country. And that's an essay by Todd, a more political essay. This is what his first slide would have been for us today, and you can see why the question of the aesthetic will be raised in relation to the question of the architectural. I should say also that Todd is, for reasons I still do not understand, been selected or sought out by Mark Wahlberg, whom I can only think of showing my age as Marky Mark. And Marky Mark is paying Todd a lot of money to develop a TV series, which apparently both HBO and Netflix are extremely interested in, which is supposed to be called Architecture, the Most Dangerous Architecture in the World. And this was a sentence or phrase that, this is going to sound kind of implausible as architectural criticism. And as I say it, I'm thinking maybe he's just lying to me. But this is a phrase that J. Edgar Hoover is supposed to have used in talking about Los Angeles architecture in the middle of the 20th century. So Marky Mark and Todd are at work as we speak in doing this, but he's not here today. Yeah, so the other, well, he'd be happy to be here today, but he's lucky to be doing the other. So the part I would say a bit more about this is that my own sense of this panel actually comes out of a set of aesthetic concerns and really kind of a set of aesthetic figures. Everybody who's on here is on here in part because I just actually am really interested in what we want to call the beauty of their work. I first came to know that Sharon Johnson and Marklee, I should say, are the principals in the LA-based architecture firm Johnston and Marklee. Among their recent projects are the new Menil Drawing Institute, and the renovation of the MCA here in Chicago. They've long been involved with work in the arts, and actually I first came to know them through their association with the photographer James Welling. Anybody who knows Jim's work will have a sense of its extraordinary combination of elegance and originality and of just how beautiful it is. And it was, for me, an exceptional introduction to Sharon's and Mark's. And actually, when I was putting these things together yesterday morning, I made myself a little test. I just started looking at a lot of Johnston Marklee photographs on the internet, and I thought I should be able to figure out which ones were made by Jim Welling. And thank God, even though I could be lying, but I'm not. I actually identified one right away, and this is actually a Jim Welling photograph of Porch House, and you can get both something of the aesthetic of Porch House and something of the aesthetic of Jim Welling. So our next speaker is Daniel Shea. Daniel Shea is a photographer, the winner in 2018 of the 12th Foam Paul Huff Award, given to a photographer under the age of 35. He is also, we are very proud to say, the holder of an MFA from the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts here at UIC. But I actually came to know his work before I knew about his UIC connection. It was, since we're sticking with Kant, in a disinterested way, and long before I became dean of the college. But actually, kind of truth in packaging, I've been closely involved with his work for the last sort of 2 or 3 years. We've worked together on 2 books, which are mainly his, but to which I've made a contribution. And I have a kind of serious investment in his aesthetics, and will defend it even against Tom. And our next to last speaker, Andrew Zago, is partner with Laura Bauman and founder of Zago Architecture and a member of the faculty of the School of Architecture here at UIC. What you see on the screen is his contribution to the 2017 Chicago Biennial, which is a way to think both about architectural facades, about screens, which I learned a whole lot about earlier today, and for me, anyway, also the new relevance of color field painting. That is part of the relevance, let's say, of the Welling aesthetic. Also, if you go out, I'm always confused in this building, but if you go out and turn in the right, turn left coming out of here, you will see the long hall which we're trying to figure out some way to get the money to pay to hang this thing out there. So actually, on the way out, if anybody just wants, is there a cookie jar or something out there? You could pass the hat. Yeah, we could just pass the hat. It's GoFundMe. Yeah, we should do GoFundMe. I actually first, though, came to know his work through Bob's suggesting that I take a look at his amazing video, XYT Detroit Streets, which I've actually now looked at dozens of times, and which I've been trying to think of a way to write about for the last 3 years, and which I hope, and now I asked him, confirmed, he will talk a bit about today. Stanford Quencher is professor of theory and criticism at Pratt in New York, the co-founder of Zone Books. I did a thing, I just sort of looked up quickly on Wikipedia. You should never introduce people from Wikipedia, so I stopped. I know you shouldn't. So someone said earlier today about how, yeah, Wikipedia, we can trust it more than Britannica. Whoever said that, that's not true. Like if you look at my Wikipedia page, it's been hacked so often that actually it now contains only the barest biographical information and a long section called criticism. So it's like you look on there, you don't know what I think, but you know that people really don't like what I think about that. So it explains it at great length. I think that's not appropriate. So if you were introducing me by Wikipedia, you'd say, so another thing wrong with Walter Ben Michaels is, so yeah. So I actually did that, then I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with the idea that you need no introduction. So that said, we should go ahead and get started. So Sharon and Mark, if you want to get started.
Thank you, Walter. We're delighted to be here. There's a period of time when I was also referred to as Marky Mark by friends of mine. So I'm glad with his absence to feel part of that role.
There's a real coherence to our program.
So today we decided to share with you two bodies of work that are parallel or tangential to our production, to our buildings in our office. The first is Montages, which deals with the restaging of history in our lens. And the other is the post-staging of our projects in collaboration with artists. So I said the word stage 2 times. I think that's enough work to contextualize our presentation in today's context. So montages are something that we have done since the beginning of our practice. These are physical pieces, construction paper, and then reproduction of sometimes iconic, sometimes non-iconic images of architectural work, or sometimes later on film stills. Oftentimes there are abstract profiles of the work that are grafted onto these found images, and there often appears as disembodied abstraction. You know, for us, on one hand, they are design tools. On the other hand, I think in the era of this saturated image, where we look at history through images, I think for us it's a way of measuring the work up against these images. I think the inspiration of this group of work started when we watched this interview of David Lee Roth in MTV when he was still with Van Halen. I think he was asked what he wanted this upcoming album to, what effect he wanted this upcoming album to be. And he said, I want this album to be so hot that after you play this, when you put it back on the shelf, it will burn all the other albums. You know? So I thought that's, for me, is like measuring up against history. Yes, from Southern California. So for us, it's also a way of reenacting the history of the field, performing a certain restaging of precedents and images. So certainly, I mean, this is a very antiquated way of working. I think we were certainly inspired by the work of Mies, in this case, the concert hall from 1942. What we were interested in was when we found the original image of the background was a factory, not a factory, but an airplane hangar by Albert Kahn. So we found the original image in this book, and then we superimposed it back on the Mies image and tried to see what are the images that Mies had cropped out. You know, so when we saw this image, it was pure whimsy. But we thought it was kind of interesting, the ways that the airplane was cropped out. And so it started off a series of work. I mean, the first project I think we used this collage was the Hill House, and I think the original image was such a important icon for post-war living in Southern California, and sometimes I think we ask the question, what role did the architecture actually play in this icon? You know, could we take away the canopy? Could we take away the roof? Could we take away the foreground and reduce the whole essence of the photograph into this corner condition in relationship to a distant view? I think as a design tool, it helped us reinforce the importance of this continuous profile of the building. You know, this is the original photograph. So the first series started off with some images by Julius Shulman, and then the second one, of course, is from the Kaufman house, where Julius asked Mrs. Kaufman to lie in front of the pool to block that pool light. Certainly, we love the depth of the Kaufman house that we choose to retain in relationship to the layers of landscape that's behind. You know, so for us, reinforcing this flatness in relationship to the depth. This is another one, the Ark House, which is actually an accessory building that's built to a Neutra house. The Sten House of 1934 was when Richard Neutra moved out to LA not long ago. He was still doing houses with these semicircular porches. When he worked for Eric Mendelsohn in Dahlem in Berlin, it was very much that type of language before he had the spider leg columns or the corner window or his more mature language. You know, the original image. This is a collage of the porch house, and the image we used was Craig Elwood's bank in, I think, Hermosa Beach. But there was a certain thing about depth and lightness about this image that we're interested in also this flatness in contrast to the curvature of the porch house and the kind of neo-rationalist heaviness of the columns that we try to contrast against. This is the gallery at Grota Ferrata, where we superimposed on an image of Marcel Breuer's house exhibition in MoMA. You know, I think it was something about MoMA's or Breuer's image or the building profile, the roof and this horizontality in contrast to the New York skyline of that period in the background. Or the Butterfly House in Malibu, where we took fragments of Philip Johnson's glass house. I think we were always interested in this notion of how buildings in relationship to nature, as opposed to using nature as a wallpaper, in Philip Johnson's word, versus a more scenographic way of isolating or framing these images. This is the creative office building in Grota Ferrata outside of Rome that we use Tarani's Casa de Fascio photograph, where Mussolini was giving a speech, and then there are actually not as many people as you think in this picture, right? I was talking to Elisabetta Tarani, and she talked about how Tarani himself did some proto-photo montaging back into the days where there seems to be more people in front of that plaza. It's not really trying to measure up this building against Tarani, but I think for us it's also about a certain autonomy of Tarani's architecture when it's taken out of context. This is the House project that was never built, and it's overlaid on an lesser-known montage of Mies van der Rohe's Friedrichstrasse skyscraper. So it's not the big 60 by 48-inch one in MoMA, but the smaller version when it was still, the photography was still very present in the work, in the montage. Or the Hut House in Kauai in Hawaii, which was you know, without the Kobe sculpture and the cruciform column. This is the facade for the Design Miami project that we did. And certainly, I think the two spatial paradigms of Lower National Gallery, what's happening on this, you know, universal space above, versus the more compartmentalized space in the basement. I think this notion of continuity and having a hard boundary is something that we have always been interested. I think the collage where we did for the future master plan of the MCA, we tried to embody that. On one hand, Clyde Hughes' interior, which has this type of continuous a ceiling that suggests this spatial continuity in relationship to super studios. This is an example of a film still. This is the Vault House. I think when we did the Vault House was the house on the beach, and we just thought, what is the best house ever that was built in front of, and we couldn't think of another one. And this is certainly from the image of, this is another image, but similar, of Michel Piccoli on top of Casa Malaparte. Stan Allen wrote a little bit about this group of collages in relationship to Godard's work, and he thought that Godard's work is always the history, and the medium of film is always embedded in his own work, and he talked about this as a conversation with the past, where the new could emerge from the past. I think this is one conversation that we have always been engaging in our own work. Yeah.
Right, so the second body of work that we wanted to talk about today was our artist collaboration projects, which often happen as a kind of post-production project after the project is somewhat complete as a building. And I think for us, these projects have given us an opportunity to kind of cast new light, both perhaps on how our buildings might be used or experienced through the lens of other kinds of occupants, in this case, artists. And the work, in a way, this kind of mode of collaboration came out of the collage that we made for the Hill House, and we made this image and it started to get published a bit, and some of our friends felt like we better finally meet Julius Schulman because he might not be that happy that we were trafficking his image around to support our building. So we met Julius and he said, yeah, that's cool, but please invite me to photograph the building when it's done. And so that was the beginning of a pretty interesting friendship and collaboration to produce a portrait of the Hill House. Julius at this point was well into his 90s. He had a collaborator, but it was quite a wild ride. But anyway, I think what was interesting for us about these images was that the kind of cinematic way that he created this portrait, the strength of the form of the house sort of dissolves into this twilight condition. The way he worked with lighting, sort of extreme and kind of odd placements of lighting, so that the house in a way is a background for some event that's happening that you can't even see over in the corner through these odd reflections. And the ways that he created a character of some of the stronger elements of the house, like the stair. Julius brought all of his furniture, his sort of pea-stained old egg chair, and other accessories were very carefully staged in relationship to the architecture. Around this time, we also finished another house, which it has a lineage that connects back to Tom in the early days of Morphosis, and it's on the site of the 2468 studio from the early 70s in Venice. This is called the Sale House, and when it was finished, there was a period of time where the house wasn't occupied, and we were interested in thinking about what does that mean for this domestic space to be empty, and how could we invite another kind of occupation of the house. And so Livia Corona created a portfolio called House for Sale. Our client's last name was Sale. And so she brought in a series of actors, these kind of senior citizens that created this almost looky-loo like sale or break-in scenario into the house. And she was inspired by sort of the colors that we were kind of riffing off from the Sale House and some of the sort of mathematical order of the 2468 house that were embedded in our project. And created this sort of new narrative of these gentle actors inhabiting the house in a peculiar way. So I think that this kind of narrative of sort of turning the house into something that's almost like a public space, thinking of it as a stage for performance, is something that sort of fascinated us.
I mean, I would add, this house, when we designed the house, it was in relationship to 2468. So the dimension of the house, the 20 by 20 square, all the windows are 2 by 2, 4 by 4, 6 by 6, or 8 by 8. And then we invited this artist, Jeff Elrod, to help us with the color, and we're reacting to the pure colors of the windows of 2468, and then we did an alternative version, so it's less pure version of cyan, magenta, yellow, and also the gray on the exterior is the same gray as the photographic gray card, so the most neutral color to bring out the saturation of the interior. So when Livia took it, she was fascinated with the mathematics of both the color scheme and the mathematics of the house. That's why you always see 1, 2, 4, 6, or 8 characters in her portfolio.
But I think
Yeah.
as a larger project, this, the fact that the Morphosis studio came before us, we built this project, and we invited a number of artists, Livia and others, to do sort of stage engagements with the house, sort of almost like a chess game, this sort of ongoing trading off of authorship is something that I think this work and even the collages that we showed kind of embody that interest, something that is ongoing today. So these images are of the Vault House by Jack Pearson, and I think for us, these images kind of depict the house not as something that's occupiable, but as something almost empty in the series of fragments where it almost becomes a backdrop to frame something far beyond it, just literally the landscape of the beach, the horizon, and somehow in a way the sort of climate, the atmosphere of this site in Southern California almost overtakes it. It sort of dissolves back into that landscape. That sort of becomes a background building, and that's quite interesting to us. And then there's a number of photographers that we've worked with, both in this kind of project where they've created portraits of our houses, or we've gone back and designed exhibitions for them. This is Veronica Kellendorfer, creating a portrait, a sort of diptych portrait of the Hill House, superimposing it back into a landscape, a different Southern California landscape of Catalina Island. So thinking about landscape, not only of the site, but of a kind of extended kind of ecology of Southern California. Or Ann Mueller, who's a Swiss artist who traveled very many times to California to visit us. We worked on our book with her, and the way in which she began to superimpose the Hill House, which is, of course, on the left, back into a kind of constructed landscape through this method of the triptych. Marianne created the extended cover of a book that we published a couple of years ago called House as a House, and these diptych collages are capturing both our work but situating it back into the landscape that very much informs how we think about our work in Southern California. Louisa Lambert is another artist that we work with a lot, both as a critic of our work and also in a kind of production mode, and these are images of hers from the Hill House. And she, for those of you who know her work, she almost never looks at exterior spaces. She's always looking at questions of the interior. So these are fragments of the Hill House, and what for her, she was, by focusing on such a small detail, just a simple corner, but looking at subtle transformations over time with light and shadow from this projective corner to a more reentrant intersection of a set of materials, reveals a kind of fragility about the house that is also kind of germane to how we thought about the atmosphere of the interior. Wally Beshti is an artist we've also collaborated with on a lot of different kinds of projects, and he was quite fascinated with sort of revisiting this kind of software that Dan Graham had looked at with this sort of voice bubbles, and so he captured something that is sort of a latent quality of our work in the way that we think not only about the conversation among the projects, but in this sort of almost humorous way in which the sort of face anthropomorphic quality of the buildings produces a kind of exchange across projects. And then Torbjörn Roland, hard to really say exactly what this narrative is about, but I think for him, the idea of the house as a stage is maybe in its most literal sense, where it's either both the villain or somehow the refuge for this strange staged action that's taking place around the house. And finally, with Jim Welling's work that Walter mentioned, Jim is also someone that we have a kind of reciprocal relationship with, and he created a portrait for the Porch House. And here it's a kind of massive, very heavy concrete building, and through his interest in light and his focus on these details of skylights and windows, sort of dissolved much of that sort of heaviness into something that was almost ethereal, where he's capturing a kind of atmosphere, the imperfections, the qualities of the house that are maybe unseen by the traditional sort of house owner. And I think maybe just to close, to say that I think these kinds of collaborations started early in our career and have now sort of folded back into the way we practice and the way that we set up workshops, think tanks. I think there's a kind of way that we sort of use this practice to sort of turn inside out, a more traditional sort of inwardly focused way that architects practice by creating, bringing in diverse voices, using different mediums to expand the discourse around our work.
Thank you.
So my name is Daniel Shea. I'm not an architect. I'm an artist, barely, I guess. I'm a photographer. I'm like a dad on vacation. No, I'm joking. I make art. I do exhibitions. I work in books. And I'm going to have a recent book I published called 4335 10th Street, just playing while I talk. So yeah, I work on books specifically, and I think of the object itself as the work, and not necessarily a container for the work. Certainly, sometimes it contains work, but the bookiness itself is really important to me. So I just want to preface what I'm about to say with that. And with Walter, we've worked on 2 books together, and considering, I think about books in a very like parts to whole relationship, and Walter thinks about the things he thinks about in a similar context. The colors are also way off, but I'm gonna let my OCD brain just not pay attention to that. We've had a kind of deeply collaborative relationship, so a lot of what I'm about to say is actually informed by a series of conversations I've had with Walter over the years. So I'm interested in the story of architecture as well as architecture as a subject matter. In 2013, I'd moved to New York City, Long Island City, and I had been traveling back to Southern Illinois to finish a book called Blizner, Illinois. And Blizner was a story about a town that had gone through or deindustrialization, and it attempted to establish a chronology of what happened in that place. And I just want to read the last page from Walter's essay for that book. He wrote, "It matters that Blizner is a fictional town. It's fictional in the sense that it's a composite, not one town among others, not a slice of reality, but a constructed image of the whole. And that whole necessarily includes Long Island City, in the sense that the decline of Southern Illinois is inseparable from the rise of Long Island City." So in other words, LIC doesn't exclude Blizner. The 2 are enmeshed. So I live in Long Island City. It's a neighborhood in Queens that has gone through a really dramatic makeover. It's kind of Hudson Yards light, involving all sorts of politics and international finance and battles between real estate developers. And so I have been thinking a lot about economic activity and economic stagnation happening simultaneously as 2 aspects of the same thing, connected less by a narrative than by a logic. Which is something Walter and I connected a lot on. This simple insight that it's not one thing or another, but one thing and another, or potentially one thing because of another, became an important perspective shift. My own aspirations as an individual or artist weren't inconsequential. They mirrored the socioeconomic shifts being described in my work. So in 4335 10th Street, which is also the address where I live and work, my position in all this is a context that not only forms a perspective in which to see the world, but represents a position that is complicit and internal to those wider macroeconomic and political forces. That is to say, again, the subject of capitalism vis-a-vis its logic, which I think I lifted directly from something you said at some point. I like to consider the art world in New York in the 1960s. Minimal works by artists like Judd and Flavin, despite their intentions, fetishized industrial processes in a way that sought to render them almost invisible. This happens at the moment that we see the industrial order start to rust, as Hal Foster has noted, and these works show in old warehouses retrofitted as art galleries or museums like Dia Beacon. So post-industrial economies are starting to take shape. These types of works were really only made possible by the availability and low rent of former industrial spaces. So what's interesting to me is, again, the relationship between activity and stagnation, and how it might come back and change the relationship between ambition and execution. Dia Beacon is a massive renovated post-industrial space. It shows industrial art scaled so perfectly that the notion of showing art in a neutral space becomes impossible. The architecture and the work hang in suspension, connected by multiple logics at once. And yet, think about how artists engage with politics. Often, it's from a sacred position of observer. The external world is somehow endlessly observable, as if everything about art making exists in a hermetic bubble, miraculously not changed, filtered, impacted, or influenced by these other types of forces in the world. To further this split between the external, observable, outside, we make work in the internal, deeply interior space of the studio, or any type of surrogate space that might exist for the studio. Obviously, lots of artists have, make work that is not object-based, or it's performative or video or what have you. So I wanted to make a project whose subject matter was ostensibly observable conditions of late capitalism as mirrored by my own movement through the world, as not necessarily how they are correlated, but as they are potentially causal. So my practice has always been based in the real. I'm a photographer, but finding ways to access the real through a type of poetics. These poetics often exacerbate what it feels like irreconcilable tensions, specifically in photography, representation and responsibility, and by extension, art's neoliberal stratification. And just a note about the architecture and provisionality of the art fair, or even biannual, which we were talking about earlier. One thought I had when the smart folks up here were talking about that is that it is a physical representation of where things exist within the market that those objects exist within, right? So by design, either the architecture is incidental or it's an act of retrofitting. So I actually think those things are probably exactly what they should be. If part of the project is to kind of keep things transparent in otherwise very non-transparent marketplaces. Simultaneously, 4335 10th Street is a book about architecture. And Michael Heiser famously said, "Size is real, scale is imagined size." So why architecture? Like many things here today, architecture is about embedding ideas in form, but it has a fascinating shelf life. Despite maybe articulating something about the values of the architect who designed the building, or the society that produced it, many buildings outlive these individuals or groups of organized individuals, and we have an object with a potentially distended shelf life. So architecture sits between two registers of time, a human time scale and a geological time scale. So this book in part explores the architecture and construction of residential condos in my neighborhood, the historic and modernist architecture of the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, which is what the book opened up on, and the broad landscape of disuse in a California desert town. The book began with a really simple premise: to observe the residential real estate boom in my neighborhood by photographing it, and to tease out more specifically what forms and details could be placed within a recent history of architecture. From there, a constellation of places and ideas started to develop. So after I moved to New York City, I would walk around at night and honestly just loved the way the buildings looked. These concrete skeletons illuminated from the inside out. I found them very beautiful. It's often just the final stages of construction that makes these buildings so awful to look at. The cheap sidings and plastic and glass that complete the buildings. And then, of course, all the other things that happen as a result of that type of gentrification, which is often very violent. I realized that these concrete skeletons resembled modernist architecture, and perhaps that was influencing my experience of them. The more I thought about this, the more I realized that the resemblance was more than a formal resemblance, that there was a less tenuous connection between a historical moment and a contemporary moment. But I guess before I talk about that, some context on Brasilia. Brasilia was and is a modernist city built from scratch in the late 50s, early 60s. And by the way, a lot of what I'm talking about, I'm used to speaking in an art context. I know lots of folks here study architecture and know all this stuff. So Brasilia was built in the late 50s, early 60s as part of a nationalization project to move the capital from the coast to the interior of the country. A useful analogy is Washington, D.C., which is kind of a museum for architecture as well. And the book opens with these pictures of Brasilia before segueing into photographs of contemporary architecture or architecture in ruin in the desert. So it's a reflection of a real trajectory of modernist style in architecture. Modernist architecture was famously engaged with developing suitable housing for workers, and there was a deeply egalitarian principle at work within its utility. Of course, many of these early thinkers and architects went on to have established firms and develop skyscrapers for international companies, which in turn also established a legacy of modernist architecture. And over time, residential architecture in cities began to reflect these buildings to the point now that that's exactly what these towering condo complexes look like, skyscrapers. So you begin with a desire to house workers and end with a project to house the wealthy, and it can be placed within this pretty discrete trajectory. If Brasilia or modern architecture was about developing a utopia for civic engagement, contemporary residential architecture is about establishing a utopia for consumer engagement. The driving mechanic is, of course, the aspirational logic of neoliberal capitalism. Through thinking through this trajectory of ideas, I realized the book would deal with the relationship between ambition and execution. First, the familiar idea of modernist ideas failing in the face of pressure, real or imagined. And just a side note, I love that artists especially love talking about the failure of modernism. It's one of the few things in history that got to fail once and we never tried again. Second, the ambition of something like architecture as a vehicle for changing society being eventually reduced to a formal style through repeated execution. And finally, as the desert work eventually shows here in the book, how that's manifest in a type of physical entropy in the world. And regarding these desert pictures, I was simultaneously photographing in an area called Searless Valley, a cluster of small towns in Death Valley, California, a place where the extraction industry remains its only lifeline. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the scope and history of cities organized by the relation between capital and labor, and the construction site as a stage for a type of social relations as dictated by politics against the backdrop of interurban development. But back to Brasilia, one of its ambitions was that it would house the people that built it. And of course that failed. And I like to imagine a developer saying something out loud today in New York City and actually meaning it. So to me, the aha moment came when I started paying attention to these viewing panels, these windows or portals that exist on the plywood that protects the outside world from the construction site, and vice versa. At the start of the recent development boom in New York City, citizens would complain about not being able to see what was happening in their own backyard. And so the city mandated that every X amount of feet, these windows had to be placed in response to this civic concern, which so poetically and concisely articulates the relationship between knowing and seeing, which double downs on my position here as maker. The book offers a reflexivity on my complicity in not just a changing socioeconomic political paradigm, but on the recent evolution of gentrification. We know that white artists pre-gentrify traditionally black and brown city neighborhoods by establishing signals for other less adventurous whites to feel comfortable. But how do the products of their labor, artists, also exemplify the economic changes of the last half century? Who do they produce art for, both culturally and as commodities? My work has been bought by real estate developers in the recent past. And if you cross your eyes for a minute and see the world a bit blurrier, the art market and the real estate market function in a really similar way. They're wildly unregulated markets of intense speculation. So in this imperfect analogy, both are driven by an aspiration whose foundation is the scarcity of highly coveted objects and spaces, and they are driven by a desire for a distinct position within a hierarchy. For the art collector, this is about status and proximity to power, and for the real estate buyer, this manifests in location and height, reflected in a more literal hierarchy. These foundations are built on a philosophy of unchecked and mythical individualism. Part of the success of neoliberal philosophy can be attributed to its deep affinity with some of the broader cultural forces of postmodernism, which deepens the analogy between real estate and art. And also just thinking about that quote that was on the screen for a while before. I think maybe I'll leave it at that. Yep, thank you.
I'm going to present, I guess, a little bit of a slight appetizer plate of 2 or 3 things that I've worked on in relatively recent years that I hope have some relationship to the third panel, which I think Bob categorized finally as art. And so we seem to be on track for that, and I'm going to go full ahead with that. And we're specifically, Walter, mentioning the problematization of the relationship of a work to the beholder. And so I have two things, and this is it. From a technical examination of the erasure of viewpoint to a non-technical embrace of varied constituencies. So these are going to be two different trajectories that I'll go over in hopefully not too long of a period of time. The first one will lead ultimately to the films that Walter was talking about. When I go through this, I do want to, there's a couple of things that I'm always extremely conscious of, even self-conscious of. Some of this work that I'm showing, I know enough about my ignorance of the disciplines of either photography or film to try to not place them into that lineage. I think of this more, I guess, within the notion of the structure of representation. In particular, I think urban representation, and these are sort of fragments of a longer talk with a lot of, I think, significant digressions, and I've tried to weed out as many of the digressions as possible. But starting here with the illustration by Abraham Botze from one of his manuals on perspective, it's kind of classic. The thing I love about it is it explains perspective by drawing an axonometric, because you have to actually get out of, and we embrace this difficulty of the sort of meta problem of how you represent structures of representation. But we all understand this great invention of the Renaissance, the reorganization of the entire world around the privileged viewpoint of the single eye. We know the positive and negative history of that. And I just want to take it's a very specific path I want to take through certain kinds of forms of urban representation that lead inexorably to my own work. So I think that's how I've structured it. And so sort of a series of diagrams, my own little axonometric of how a perspective would work, and the two cones, the two pyramids of the vanishing point, and the location of the eye becomes the key starting point in this explanation. And the final effect then is the truncated pyramid projected onto a sheet of paper. The great miracle of being able to actually construct a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface is something that is the foundation as well of the working drawing, the entire infrastructure of how we conceive of architecture as architects have to do with that capacity of three dimensions embedded within two. And there's an urban dimension to that as well. This is one of the so-called ideal city urbino panels from around 1480. So here the entire world is organized around, it's not only a way of depicting the world, but actually it becomes an organization of the world itself. One of the digressions that I won't go into is the dismantling of this kind of space is also well known, and there's a particular trajectory that I would argue extends from Piranesi's views of Rome and his ideal prisons through his imaginary prisons to Cubism, let's say a painting of Juan Gris. This idea of being able to embed multiple points of view within a single image would be one trajectory. I'm going to go with a different one that's decidedly more nerd-like and maybe less artistic, but one that I can dismantle more readily. And this is, I would take the turning point, the panorama, which is not a general term, it's a specific patented term by Robert Barker. I think it was June 17th, 1787, in Edinburgh. He files a patent for this. And this is really a kind of, this is the first part, a wild intensification of this idea of the single point of view, and all of, not only is it the window that you're looking into, but this entire circumference that you can look in any direction, and that same point of view has been, the world has been reorganized around that. And so this would be the sort of diagram of that to compare to the first one, the single station point, and then you have a continuous sweep. If I was to, so many perspective paintings, and they get so close to one another that it becomes a continuous sort of smear, and that's what gives you the strange curvature that you see within a panorama. Once you wrap it around yourself, it doesn't. I've actually never been into a panorama, so I shouldn't admit that today, but I know what I know how they work. You don't see the curve because it's against the curved surface, and one cancels the other out. But in fact, it does have this kind of curvature. And so here's this way of intensifying that. Always within, here's a detail of the view of Edinburgh from 1789. Always within perspective is the fundamental artifice of it. To imagine that now that we see in perspective. I was going to title this, I don't see in perspective, but I believe this is, I believe that a perspective is wholly a cultural construct. A camera is basically a machine to reconstruct a perspective. It's not that it's reconstructing how we see. And I thought this was the perfect, I always love this example of Albrecht Dürer's from his painter's manual, 1525. He shows different apparatuses for constructing perspective. What's great about this one is and you can go through and figure out the logic. You could not imagine a more pain in the ass way of constructing, and it's essentially digitizing this information. Your screen is doing this all the time when you're rotating it. But the thing is, neither of them see the perspective. The eye point is actually the hook on the wall. So this is not about constructing a visual effect. This is about constructing a visual effect. It's not about reproducing what you see. So I like this, the fact that this is a perspective from the point of view of the wall and not from the artist. The next step in this is a kind of step in crudity, and this is with the invention of the camera. This is Eadweard Muybridge, that I'm sure a lot of you know, and we know his work that looks like this. This is the first animated film of the horse to settle a bet that Leland Sanford had with his other rich buddies. But this is the mammoth plate panorama of San Francisco. So this is 1878, 91 years or so after the panorama. And this is just that. It's taken from on top of a hill, and here there's a couple of things that happen. First off, with photography, you have an extreme fidelity that you don't get with the painting. Again, there's the word horse, but it also is considerably cruder. So what you have is a series of chunks taken like that, and you put them next to each other. So this is the result is imperfect. You don't get that smooth. There aren't any of those curves introduced into it, and when it's displayed, it's not put around you in a circle. It's simply put out on a wall, and you see it when you look at it that things simply don't match and line up, and this is the problem with that kind of panorama. No, the next one is this is to me is the radical break, and this is why I introduced the notion of the camera. This is Ed Ruscha's Every Building on Sunset Strip. I'm sure a lot of you know from 1966. It's an urban representation, like the panorama, like the photographs, etc. They're very, very large. So this book stretches out, I don't know, 10 feet on a floor. And so what was interesting to me was the diagram of this, because here what happens is, and this is a detail of it, I'm sure a lot of you know it, where are you standing? There isn't a point of view for this at all. In fact, there's a whole series of them sort of scanned along the street, point after point, and so this is an image of the city that's not built around this single viewpoint. And that's maybe not that, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is not maybe an original observation, but I just pointed out technically. So this maintains the chunkiness of the Muybridge because it uses the camera, but it cuts apart that point and puts it along a line instead of it being, a circle coming along. And this is what you get. You get these series of things and lots of overlaps and things missing. Another thing which is going to become quite important in discussing the film is this comes in with when you paint a panorama, you can paint it as one instant in time. It's technically impossible to photograph an instant in time. Every photograph is a period of time, and there's interesting things that happen as a consequence of that. But certainly, even if we thought of it as an instant, a panorama is simply one photograph after another, after another, after another, and what happens in the first picture is earlier than what happens in the last one, and cars move and you don't get it in the next one, et cetera. So it builds in another element of time. Here's a work that tries to eliminate that element of time by making sure it's in the dead of night when nothing's around. This is Stan Douglas, Every Building on 100 Hastings Street. So this is 2001, 45 years later, actually. So this is a long story. 45 years it took to get to Photoshop. and Stan Douglas, and I've not seen this in person, but it's an extremely long photograph also. This is like 15, 18 feet across. It's a couple of giant prints put together, composed apparently of 21 separate photographs that then get carefully sort of photoshopped, smudged together so that the roughness of those various things simply don't happen. It does, however, it is still, each of these are a little perspective, and you can see if you look at the crosswalks that it's a perspective, and so it isn't, it is still, let's say, it's not the single point of view, it's not one every building, it's a lot of them, right? But I thought that's not enough. I want more. I want to have so many that you would have thousands and thousands of images, and you'd put them together in such a way that each one is, if now we're dealing digitally a pixel wide, simply a pixel, and each one is a separate photograph. And this is the diagram. So this is, now we start to get into the films, and this is the kind of precursor to them. It is like a continuous eye-point scan of a street. There isn't any more, any depth. And this is interesting, there still is a depth top to bottom that goes back in perspective, but this eliminates side-to-side perspective. And so the thought was that we were very interested, if we didn't want to have a perspective, there's not that many parameters to play with. If you're not talking about, I'm not talking about the content of the work and whether it's good or not. I'm really talking about the nuts and bolts of projective systems. But we felt like we overcame that. There was not that this was the aim going back to Muybridge or even the Stan Douglas, but for us, we thought, boy, what if you just kept extrapolating from this? And this is where our Detroit films started. They started as a single image. It was never an intention to make a film. It was an intention just to do like, as if you placed a scanner against a street and were just able to scan the entire image. And this had a lot to do with the city of Detroit, and we were trying to figure out how to make this happen. I'll show you one little clip of these. I should mention the Detroit film series is owned, an edition of it is owned by the Art Institute, and it's on display right now. So you can, for Zoe, she couldn't stick around this afternoon, but she was here, so. And here you don't have any of the perspective whatsoever. Everything is looking straight on it, and it's a whole series of images looking straight on it. So then going back to time and motion again, every image is a time. This would be, I'm going to run through this because this gets into the thickets pretty quickly. So every picture takes time. We know to do a smooth panorama now with photography is easy. This is my iPhone, right? We can do this all the time. So what Muybridge couldn't do, we don't look at it and say, gee, how would that possibly happen? It's a pre-digital problem. I don't know if any, photo buffs, if you know the wide lux camera. This was a handheld, I think Japanese-made panoramic camera. The lens was a little turret that would spin, and the film was behind it. And so it would just pan like that and shoot a group. And so this was an analog. And none of the things I'm talking about are digitally accelerated, but none of them are a fundamentally digital problem. This was worked out here. In fact, John Chamberlain, the sculptor, that's not usually associated with photographs, but he had a long series where he had this camera, and because it would spin over a period of time, he'd like move it around while he's taking the picture. And this is just one example. There's quite a few of these, and they're kind of great. And then this would be the aside. The Slitscan. No photograph is a single instant in time. This is a photograph that Sanford, I know you know extremely well, and this is held up as a kind of exemplar of all of the dynamism of the 20th century coming rushing at us by Lartigue. This is the Grand Prix at Dieppe in June of 1912. But it happens like this, not because of anything other than the fact that cameras at the time had an aperture that was a slit that went from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. That was the exposure time. And so the top of the picture is earlier than the bottom of the picture. And what's that? Are you sure? I don't think so. I got it diagrammed here. Look. Yeah, but the top is earlier, Because what happens, he has a tripod, the car's coming by, and he does this. So the top of the picture, the flagpole is here. At the bottom of the picture, no, you're right, it's the other way, yeah. But at the same time, the car is traveling faster than he's rotating it, so things that are standing still go back in one direction, and things that are moving faster than the camera go in the other direction. If something was rotating at the same, if something was going by at the same speed, it would appear normal. And so there is this kind of cross projection of one thing against the other. So it's not a magic trick. It has to do with the physics of it. You know, there's other ways of imprinting multiple periods of time on a single image. Not to that one I was showing you because you could actually break down a single image and see all the effects of it. This is a very familiar, I'm sure, to a lot of you, Murray's Man Walking from 1882. Multiple exposures on the same picture, and it captures that moment in time. And so you have a single image and something is moving, and by having multiple exposures, this would be the diagram of the Murray. No, the other, so this is, I'm explaining those films. This is, so there is, and this is a well-known, it's almost a parlor trick, the Slitscan moving picture. What this is you have a still camera. This is what every movie is. It's a stack of pictures, right? It's like a block of Velveeta cheese, you know, sliced. And you can put it all together, and you can make a three-dimensional object out of it. There's software that does this. There's no trick to it. So as something is moving, frame by frame, you see it go through there. It makes a kind of cylinder through that block of cheese. What a slit scan does is simply slice the cheese in the opposite direction, and you look at the side of a movie. So one end is the beginning of the movie, one end is the end of the movie. The first frame is the left side of the movie, the last frame is the right side of the movie, or vice versa, depending on which way you set it up. Pre-digitally, this was done with using an animation rostrum camera. This is how the special effects, the whole Stanley Kubrick, Douglas Trumbull's, the whole Stargate sequence from 2001, 1968, was done through painstaking work of months and months of slit scan photography to create these other effects. Now we do it a little simply. So this is if the camera is still and the object is moving. What we did was the opposite. With Detroit, the street was not moving, the camera moved. So in a sense, what we did was we took extremely long tracking shots of streets of Detroit, which was very, we had no license. We would just set up over a day with a team of people, a giant track in Detroit, and we would just go through with a metronome and a little cart and film it. And so you would get this thing of the streets moving along as you do that. And so the way I did that other film, this is an alternative diagram for it. It would be the middle frame. This is the same as that Detroit scene I showed, and that's a longer discussion. But anyways, we look at the city sideways, and we see this thing slowly moving. So if that was the still image, this is what we get now. It slowly changes from looking at its left side to looking at its middle to looking at its right side. I'm just going to show one of them. They're also not like movies because nothing really happens and they're not interesting. They're just like, but these are like sequence frames of some of these. These were also, I think they're not, the Art Institute owns the installation piece. They don't own just the file. There is a minimum dimension that it's supposed to be shown at. I believe it's being shown a little shorter than that. But it was shown a few years ago at like 90 feet. And this is supposed to be in that tradition of show a city with a special representation really largely. And here's some other. They're only as long as the film is wide. Some of these like the Packard plant, the Shane Boulevard. And then I remember showing this a few years ago. This was the first one we were working out. This is when Stan Allen was still the dean at Princeton. I showed this, and his comment was, as if Detroit wasn't creepy enough. But they all do this. They all slowly pan from a left view to a right view, but all of the buildings, you're looking at them as if they're all turned this way, and then they all turn this way, and they all turn that way over the course of it. So this is, really not. Not only is it not for one person, no one can see this. This is until you construct it this way. So this is that. So the thing I still didn't like is it still goes to the horizon line. So we tried to do this, and I'm not going to show this clip, but this is where as if you really put like a scan bed, like a flatbed scanner against a city and could get it this wide instead of just from a single camera. I have no idea what the technical apparatus would be to do that physically. But the idea would be, something like this. This is Mir Saeed Ali's palace at night from 1540. This idea of these kind of axonometric palaces where it's a great, it matters not how far away something is. You simply move up and down in space. There isn't any diminution in distance. This is not just making an axonometric. The entire space becomes a kind of tessellation of this sort of space. And so instead of this, it becomes something like this, that it slowly moves. We did a movie exactly like this for a project that we did for this. I'll show a couple of other things from it for the Museum of Modern Art about a foreclosed community in Rialto, California. And this is a film that over the course of several minutes, it very slowly pans across from one view to the other, and all of the figures are animated in it. And like the palace at night, there's no loss of depth for figures that are above. And there's lots of cameos in this. We got Jose Obrery and Jeff Kipnis and all kinds of... Okay, so I'm going to switch now to the second topic, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly. That was most of it. This was a project I did a couple of years ago. This is the Teatro Anatomico at the University of Padova. I forgot the year of it. The first anatomical theater in the world. The school of Andreas Vesalius, the first great anatomist of medical history. A project I've always loved, this theater that is a little tiny wooden theater sitting in this Renaissance palazzo that's the main university building. And this is going back to intense centralized diagram of space. And which is the thing, where's Albert? The thing I find weird about the Netsch is that circle in the middle reminds me too much of that. Everyone has to gather in the middle, and we're going to sit there. It reminds me too much of this. But the idea of a small theater, as a kind of space was interesting to me. But this is a photograph in the New York Times from a number of years ago of Bryant Park. But imagining a completely different way of not the kind of focused attention, but a series of renegotiated arrangements and separations that would seem to me a more contemporary idea. And so this was my first diagram for it. This is a small project that I did as a theater in the SciArc Gallery in 2002. This was the first project that was done in that gallery. There's been a whole series of them after that. And so if you imagine that axonometric view where it's just like a scan of people looking at it, this would be the way, the sort of ideal audience is that everything is happening everywhere and there's no point whatsoever. And it was built like that. And it was built also that the idea was that the space was co-produced by the architecture and the activities of bodies in space, the theatrics of it, but it was decidedly non-central and non-proscenium. And here was this very large construction that virtually took up the entire space. For the opening, this 25-piece experimental music group, Line Space Line, performed above you and below you, and everybody would you'd just walk through there, and the music was happening literally in all dimensions around you, and you could look down on it, you could just hang out on the top of it, closer to the air conditioning. You could even if you locked it up, if any of you know the SciArc Gallery, you could just hop onto it at night because it was so close, and apparently there was a lot of romantic rendezvous that took place in this at night. I'm not going to name names, but you'd know. This is that group. And then later, the Los Angeles choreographer, Anita Pace, she designed a special dance called La Fenêtre for this, where she also introduced scrims and people moving through the piece. This is just a couple of clips from the video, and this is it, just to give you a sense of its, you know, it was sort of a maze-like project, but there wasn't actually any one way to go through the maze. And then this was, you know, a project I'd mentioned. This was from 2011, 2012, a project initiated by the Museum of Modern Art, Barry Bergdahl, Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, where they asked teams of architects to look at different failed suburban situations in the midst of the foreclosure crisis and to propose alternatives for it. Ours was Rialto, California, and there was this enormous Rosina Ranch, this 2,500 homes development that basically had a heart attack, a financial heart attack. It had gone. We worked with David Bergman, who's a great urban economist, and basically the cycle that money flows through in a subdivision is quite set. It depends on speed. It depends on extreme homogeneity of process, of financial capabilities, et cetera. And so there is a accumulation within these of qualities that happen within a series of limiting lines and definite objects. And this was it. And in a more complicated discussion, this was also the problem with it. So what we proposed is something that we'd been interested in purely formal terms, is this idea of misregistration, of poor printing, or doing a bad job of it. And in doing this, the notion was that all of this mono-economy and mono-ecology of these subdivisions, which were part of what caused it to fail, because when the formula doesn't work, there's no plan B, would in fact disaggregate into a whole series of other possibilities. And so it wasn't just, this is me, this is you, this is the nature outside, this is my lawn, that you would begin to multiply these qualities. Bob Sommel was a consultant on this project, and he dubbed it property with properties. Which is, and you know, this is then, it was also reasonably Persian in its in its execution, and just a few of the studies for it. And so this was the idea of a dislocation of not a complete miss, but a dislocation of these things in terms of the individual buildings. And by the way, financial crisis is over. This is full. It's doing fine. But at the time, it seemed really dire. It was just like that. All the graded lots were just abandoned and not doing anything for a number of years. And this is, you know, how it would go out. This is the last thing. I thought someone said I was supposed to talk about Hilbersheimer today, and so I have. This idea of a relaxation of the city as being composed, or the effort to be composed as a kind of singular audience, and thinking of it, I suppose, and this is, I can't get into this in the same kind of technical clarity that I showed the other things, but let's say where you not only accept, but you try to structure a city around wildly different constituencies and try to create a clear structure in which they coexist. And so the urban grid we know, again, here's the commissioner's plan of New York, which is 220 feet by 775 feet. Did I get that right? Okay, good. An important number that I'm going to take away from today from Albert. We understand this. We understand that this, this was already explained. I don't need to go into it. We understand Hilbersheimer's ladder, and a great example of it is Lafayette Park in Detroit. Here it is in construction. I'm taking ladder. This is my direct misunderstanding of Albert's work. I already warned him. So this isolated kind of fiddlehead fern that's erupts inside of a city is seen here under construction. And then other things that happen. We get into the 1970s and the 1980s. There's a couple of projects in Berlin. The one I'm talking about here in particular is O.M. Unger's A Green Archipelago. He did this with Rem Koolhaas and others, Arthur Ovaska. And even though the idea was that the space in between was green, the representation was always against a grid. So, and if you look at that John Haydick's Berlin projects, all of these like wild figures that are loose, they're also usually on a point grid as well. So this is sort of allowing difference to happen, but my argument is that this is still within a fixed chessboard. In other words, the category in which these exist are all the same, and they're made that way by the continuous grid, and that our idea instead is this idea of a kind of heterogeneity. We talk about this, I think at some point, my friend Jeff Kipnis was talking about multiple ontologies, but I don't like saying that word, ontologies, anymore in architecture. So categorical errors, where you intentionally put things, imagine that things fall out of where they're supposed to be, and it's not just something being different than something else. But I thought this was a great example. This is, the commissioner's grid suddenly misunderstands that it's an organizing principle and thinks it's supposed to be a giant building sticking up in the air, that the two of them in a relationship to each other is an actual category flip, and they sit. And so the other part I wanted to mention is, well, we'll get back, I think I have my note here, that this is an intentional conflation of, among other things, urban diagrams and architectural form. So this was, I wrote that in a little bit of counter to what Albert was saying, that not about the architecture didn't matter, it was about the urban diagram. And I wanted to, this would be kind of, well, you mixed the two up. You didn't understand that they're supposed to be two different things, and you make the building look like an urban form. By the way, I had a session here with Peter Eisenman last semester, and he said, no, we never talked about that. That's completely wrong. So I said, you could have that. It's a great argument. And just our little project, I think Albert showed his project for Detroit. We did also a project for Detroit for the Venice Biennale. In this case, all of these are entire lectures. Immediately to the south of here is Lafayette Park, the Hilbersheimer. So this was our, almost the diagonal street was almost like a mathematical ratio of our project to that one. And this was intended as a federal project. And it was the biennial pavilion is sponsored by the State Department, and so we did this as an open letter to John Kerry. There was a very long story behind this of it basically increasing significantly the number of refugees admitted from Syria at the time, bringing them to Detroit, which is already one of the largest Middle East communities, and we did with economics and other consultants, we put together a model for this and said, now once you get this 60,000 people in there, this is how it would work, and then you need a bunch of support facilities. So each of these had a life, and they were all considered public buildings, and that's another discussion, but we tried very much to go into this categorical difference, and this is our set of the various misfit buildings. And that's the last slide. Thank you.
Honestly, I thought I was to address the problem of screen. And as it turns out, I'd say the awkwardness of what I am going to present would have been the same no matter which session I had been in. And doing this at the end of the day while everybody is tired makes it incredibly difficult, actually, because I realize it's a kind of it goes off in a completely other direction than what we're hearing. I thought to myself, in fact, I've got these words written down here as I was trying to get myself psyched up to write on the airplane this morning. The words I picked up from screen were mediator, and I thought of mediation. Material exchanges, I thought material and matter. And the other one was under-imagined, I thought imagination. Imagination, matter, and mediation. They were things I was going to work with. I think that was a real great thing, I thought, for engaging what I considered to be some of the emerging ways of framing the problems that confront architecture, and design in the way we understand our destiny, if you like, in the unfolding environment in which we live, and of which we are inseparable. I'm saying some of these things in advance because I'm going to try and skip them as I go through. In the end, performance is what I said. Well, one way or the other, Kwinter, let's just hit performance before it's all over. And I thought, okay, there's two things I found that have really blown my mind in the last several years. And I'll try to present them super simply, and if I can't, I'm just going to shut the game down and go into a discussion. One is, well, let me start with I'm not even going to, I shouldn't be telling you this. I didn't plan to do it this way. Listen to this. Humans, and humans alone, shape and reshape the environments that shape their brains. Now that is a wonderful quote. That is something that actually has occupied my thinking for quite a number of years. It is something taken from the psychiatrist or the psychiatric sort of professor and neurobiologist Bruce Wexler at Yale University. And I wanted to explain how he got to that idea. That fact that humans and humans alone shape and reshape the environments that shape their brains is the product of two underlying factors. And that is, the brain displays greater dependence of its structure and function, and by function I refer to sensory and cognitive as well as psychological function. It has greater dependency on sensory input from the environment than that of any other animal. That's number one. And number two is there is a greater amount of the neural development that takes place outside of the womb, that is, in the world and in direct engagement with the world, than any other mammal. Now, the point here, of course, is that humans are born as fetuses, and primarily it's their brain which is not yet formed, and which takes a very, very long time. So in a sense, they are the only animal whose brain development relies on input, sensory input from the surround, from the actual world. And the fact is the brain builds itself precisely around that input. So in a certain sense, no animal is quite as shaped and formed, engaged in a kind of a handshake with the physical material world and its patterns as are the human. And that puts us in a very different situation, shall we say, a very different political and ethical situation with respect to the material reality of our world. Now, there are two powerful consequences of these facts that are not typically acknowledged. The first is that the intensive interaction, or what neurobiologists call sculpting, and is sometimes referred to as neuroplasticity, the intensive interaction, this, shall we say, performance, sits on top of the more familiar morphogenetic practices, that's to say the processes of Darwinian evolution, and Darwinian evolution is primarily meant to, for the natural world, shall we say, or the living world, to generate forms as adaptations to the conditions it finds outside of itself, but it happens at a time scale entirely different from the one that happens, if you like, in the actual shaping of the brain, to produce a far more rapid and a far more context-specific and fluidly variable, one could say neurally diverse population than biological evolution, Darwinian evolution, could ever do. So what we know, in fact, is that speciation and differentiation of brain, or shall we say of human populations, is actually effectively and almost deliberately, if there is a deliberateness behind nature, it occurs precisely because of this specific condition and this relationship to the external world, which our very, shall we say, encephalized condition, our huge brains, which develop so late, if you like, and especially that develop outside the womb, take place. In other words, their dependency on the built, or shall we say, the concrete lived environment is immense, and in fact, the environment makes us as much as we make it. The second is the second important consequence is that while biological evolution stores its formal adaptations in genetic code, neurocognitive cultural evolution stores its adaptive inventions in both the material environment, the world in which we live, as well as in the intrapsychic social world itself. I wrote this amid a lot of turbulence on the airplane today, and I just want to see what that little word is I snuck in there. Oh, that's to say that there is a very significant collective aspect to it. Now, but that collectivity is always local. Every place on Earth is radically different, and in fact, every collection or group or population of brains has commonalities, if you like, which are based on the specificities of the geographical and the historical conditions in which they were shaped. And they also have, of course, the irreducible differences from one person to another, even Siamese twins, even twins, etc. And it is here, in the actual world itself, what is it? What am I referring to here? And it is here that it is instantly and endlessly retrieved. That's to say, this information that is stored. It is endlessly and instantly retrieved, activated, engaged, and transformed, yet all the while remaining well below the threshold of ethical or political awareness. Which is to say, it is only really in recent years, through these developments in neurobiology, that we have even become slightly aware of the fact that this process of design, or mutual design, is endlessly and almost violently taking place. When I say violently taking place, it happens to be true that the number of neural connections generated in the early infant brain up until at least 6 months is at the rate of 100,000 neural connections per second. Now, the truth, just those of you who don't happen to be, neurobiology nerds, the important general idea here behind neuroplasticity is that there's this unbelievable profusion, let's say, of material, of structure. The only ones that survive are the ones that get used, and the only way they get used is if there is a stimulus that passes from the external world into the internal one, shall we say, and activates those set of neurons. That is how the world shapes our brain. That is generally known as neuroplasticity. I would say that the image to keep here, I think of this little book of David Foster Wallace, which of course is just based on a cliche everybody knows. Fish don't know what the hell water is. He wrote a beautiful book, I'm sure many of you have read it, called This is Water, and it has to do with our responsibility, shall we say, of coming to an understanding of this thing that is invisible to us, which is essentially our environment. Another way to state this, for anyone wishing to better understand the place and significance of architecture, at least how I like to define it, which is, I know, is an endless irritant to architects, within the framework of human sociality and human sentience, is that the modifications that we introduce into the world around us have as their direct and ultimate effect to condition, that is to limit, modify, or expand the world inside of us. But this cognitive environmental circuit is actually incredibly complex. I'm very optimistic that I'm going to get through this in very few minutes, actually. First off, the profound interlink between biological and cultural evolution, those are the two processes of generating adaptations or producing a form world, which sit on top of one another. The link between biological and cultural evolution and their material inextricability, that's to say they're operating on the very same material, and they're forming forms, or let's say they're generating a kind of musical pattern, simply at different speeds and at different rates. It tells us that there can be no bifurcation between natural and cultural domains, between inner and outer experience, between mind and matter, and that the technical and material deployments that we call architecture and I at least would like to advocate that these extend far beyond the platitudes of single buildings. When I use the word platitudes, I mean I'm not trying to say anything nasty about architects whose primary focus is single buildings, but as Tom Main points out, is you can never really properly or responsibly consider a single building outside of the broader context. Or at least that's what we really need to reconfront today, that is responsibility. So the word I wanted to introduce here is that we call these things that we call architecture, they are immanent to us and we to it. This is a kind of a monism, and I know that doesn't mean a lot to many, but it really let's just say polemically, I would like to suggest that architecture has not yet really faced the fallacious dualisms that haunt it. And I think that is one of the tasks of architecture and of architectural theory. In a certain way, you could think of it as a kind of a restoration of, shall we say, of a unity which is, I mean, I don't know if the word would be right here, but it is both natural and ultimately ontological. 2, this in no way suggests a fatalism or a determinism, but rather the opposite. For central to the life cycle of every historical human is a two-phase unfolding. This again, this is the theory, these are the ideas that have been developed by Wexler, meaning no neurobiologist would contest it. It's just that he is probably one of the most trenchant theorists, actually, of this problem. The central to the life cycle of every historical human is a two-phase unfolding. The first is the so-called rearing phase, basically up until the age of 23, during which the unique experience of the ontogenetic subject, or the organism, the human, is processed and incorporated into his or her neurophysiological, or no, neuropsychological makeup. Her brain literally composes itself from the givens of its local and specific world. This is followed by, very roughly speaking, what he calls the adult phase. Now, what's very important to understand here is that the sculpting takes place for a good 23 years, and certainly very intensely during the first 8 to 10 years, with the information flow from the environment to the brain. And the ratio begins to shift at around the age of 23, at which point, what he calls the adult phase, in which the subject seeks to introduce into the world structures that it finds inside itself, literally to transform the outward world, to bring it into accommodation with the world that exists within it. In this sense, every generation's ethico-biological obligation is to challenge and even molest the world of its parents, that's to say, or of the preceding generation. In a sense, the world is continually remade, if you like, and this continual modification, which is really what drives history. But it's also, let's say, it's a permission. It's an absolute permission. It explains every grotesque and every beautiful architectural hypothesis that we see. To impose the entirely novel structures and relations sifted, gathered, and compiled during its neurogenetic rearing phase. This is a massively accelerated and accelerating process that intervenes within and both guides as well as expresses and deforms routine biological evolutionary unfoldings. In a certain sense, the terms life and design are fully synonymous. Now, the fatal danger here, however, would be, the mistake would be to imagine that the simple carrying forward into concrete fact of the received structures and patterns found in our ambient social surround exhausts or fulfills our historical responsibility. I have to say, and at even the risk of sounding a bit curmudgeonly, one of the things I noticed quite a bit today, especially among the generations, say, of architects and designers, educated during the 1990s, during the great sort of the automation phase, the digitization phase of architectural production, is in certain, and it's clear that their brains have been have been deeply, let's say, shaped by it. Many of them, and one of the recent examples some of you may have noticed from your efflux emails that come in, is a general project. Actually, it's probably, I even think it originated in the University of Michigan, called On Becoming Digital, in which there are extraordinary, if you like, extraordinary uncritical attempts essentially to build into the physical world the same sort of one-dimensional platitudes that one experienced, let's say, throughout one's rearing phase on the screen. That's to say, to create the same kind of, shall we say, ambiguities, essentially a kind of a, what was that game called? That the kids were playing where you had voxels, Minecraft. It was like this delirium of building a Minecraft universe actually in the world. They were building all these kind of things. So that these digital synthetic realities are not, as such, what ought to be transferred. There is a interesting, let's just say that this problem of neuroplasticity has been very profoundly politicized in the last 10 years. I won't go too much into it. There is a kind of a group, a working group of people throughout Europe and everywhere, of which Wexler is actually one, known as the Cognitive Capitalism group. But there was a book that had a beautiful title that came out by a French philosopher who was interested in producing a kind of a philosophical argument in order to acknowledge and in some ways accommodate the new understanding of what the brain actually does in the world, what its political stature is in the world. The title of the book, which in my own personal opinion is almost better than the rest of the book, is What Should We Do with Our Brains? And I think that that's a question that we can continually ask in terms of design, in a certain sense in which we understand in a way this is a project of mutual shaping. It's a project where we begin to see our destiny in the material world, and not simply, if you like, in an isolated ghetto of you could talk about of the subject. It would be a kind of abdication of our role to resist, redirect, and transform the social relations that have hijacked our sensorium. In a sense, there's not the idea of simply transferring to the external world what we discover inside of us through our rearing, but rather, in fact, to see the world as ours to modify, ours to impose, if you like, entirely new and experimental structures, a kind of a endless integration process that is this is what the nervous system does, continually integrate. So the next thing is, I won't go on too long, is I thought, well, on the performance side, my current favorite, I'm very fascinated. This is a woman named Erin Manning. This is a book a performance theorist in Canada, who was also an incredibly competent and capable philosopher. Essentially, a woman who is applying the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead to a whole gamut, a whole array of performance, which he calls performance, but which is an engagement, a social engagement with the material world. And I thought that one of her great interests, or one of the great political interests, is what she refers to as neurodiversity. She is an expert. She works a lot with autism and with autistic children, et cetera. And one of the things that she finds interesting and which she brings to a philosophical discussion, if you like, and which brings to our attention is some of the possibilities of transformation through our own sentience, if you like, is the way in which autists apprehend the world, but also organize the world, or fail to deploy the same routinized means of organizing the world, as the Kantians would say, preliminary, if you like, to perception. She comes up with a term that I've noticed is being used in architecture schools these days, although rather naively, I think, because I don't think they know what its origin is, or else they're completely doing it innocently. It's a coincidence, and that's the concept of chunking. What this term, I think it comes from one well-known autist who used that term, but it seems incredibly apt. It really describes the variability, shall we say, of how elements, if you like, in the perceptual field, in the sensorium, can be variously organized, apprehended, or sorted, shall we say, or filtered, and how they produce entirely different systems, if you like, of meaning and of engagement. And then I suppose one other idea that I would say that in some of the photographic work that we saw today, and in some of the slippage work that we see, nothing short of, I would say, a kind of way of re-chunking or experimenting, if you like, with the boundaries of how assembly, combinatorics, et cetera, of how the features of the sensorium can be, let's say, variably organized, apprehended, and brought into a system of meaning. I guess one other thing I was going to say in terms of handing off a completely workable agenda for the studios, for architects, is a chapter in the book called What Else?, in which she asks, she talks about performance is a way of asking, what else, if you like, can the body do, or what else can an object do, or what else can movement do? And you know what, I'm going to stop now. I was going to read a very short little section, which I found to be somewhat beautiful, but I think I'll leave it at that. We're all tired, and we got enough. Thank you.
So we still have some time for discussion, and I'll just start really quickly performing the traditional function of trying to make it sound like everybody was talking about the same thing. But actually, there is kind of striking. For those who've been here all day, the very first talk we heard, Ken Warren's, was about a Henry James story called The Point of View. And there's a way in which, if you think about Andrew's work, but I think this will apply, or Andrew's discussion throughout in different ways here, the whole idea of eliminating the perspective is a certain way in which what one does is eliminate point of view. And what it means to eliminate the point of view is to take the beholder in some way out of his or her relation to the picture. So what I was struck by in listening here was that if you think about a kind of clear sort of politicized view of this would be, in a way, Daniel's interest in not seeing Long Island City from the standpoint of deindustrialized Southern Illinois, and not seeing deindustrialized Southern Illinois from the standpoint of Long Island City, but seeing them both from something which doesn't count as a standpoint at all.
Until they make a lens that allows me to do that.
Until they make a lens, yeah. So, or until Andrew figures out a way. So what the point would be is to see it in a certain sense as a whole. But to see something as a whole is to see it in a way that doesn't take into account where you are in relation to it. So there's a way in which I think that's at the heart of, Andrew, you present this as a completely technical problem all the way through. And that is extremely useful for me. I'm making all these notes because I've never understood technically how anything was done. But there's a way in which that, it's striking, the ambition is in some sense the same. There's the ambition to produce something which does indeed produce an artifact which no one could see. So for Sharon and Mark, it's kind of complicated because the different kinds of photographs you produce, which are clearly both compatible with your own practice, but are yet actually not always so compatible with each other, at least from some standpoint. So if you look at Louisa Lambert's work and at Welling's work, there's a way in which it actually does produce a kind of abstraction which makes the beholder irrelevant. It produces what one might say a kind of internal form, which makes the beholder irrelevant. It's very visible even in the porch house photograph I showed. But at the same time, there's a lot of work done in the one with the empty house, I can't remember what it was called, where the whole point was there to do what seemed like sort of the opposite, to produce a kind of theatrical, to produce a narrative that goes on inside it. And he would say, I was thinking, oh my God, with Stanford, how are we going to try and work this in? But actually, Stanford's, on a higher level of abstraction, but the question, if you think you are committed to a certain kind of monism, so dualism, as we all know, has its disadvantages, but dualism produces the problem of the point of view as a way, it's constitutive, that is, the relation between the subject and the object. Monism is always an effort, or at least entails the effort, to in some sense overcome that problem. The question of whether it does, or whether you can produce a coherent monism that does. Obviously, dualism has its incoherences, but monism has its own as well. But it was striking to me that if you think about, I haven't thought about sort of the neurological work this way, and I don't know the work anywhere near as well as you do, but I do know I do know what we should do with our brain, what should we do with our brain. And there's a way in which it both is an effort to think through the monistic as a way in which the question of what it takes to be a judging subject is overcome, because it's a matter of making things with the brain, but it's also a way in which the question of what should we do is a completely normative question. And the normative question is one that's not actually easily conceivable in terms of neurology, but is conceivable precisely in terms of a set of oppositions, which on the one hand seems to invoke the point of view, what you think we should do and what I think we should do might be different, but on another hand, another way makes the point of view completely irrelevant, because the question of what we actually should do is not a function of what you or I think about it. That is, that's what it means to introduce the normative. So there's a way, it seems to me, in which there are all these different forms, although for Mark and Sharon it was in a way the most ambiguous, because it's if you're doing both. All these different talks raise the question of the point of view, and which is to say, you could put it more generally, raise the question of the subject, giving slightly different answers. And I guess so the first question, then the last question I'll ask, so everybody can sort of have their own run at it, is how do you understand this ambition toward eliminating the point of view? And how do you understand your own ambition for Sharon and Mark, maybe to start there, to both eliminate it in a certain way, but also then to put it back in, to put it back in in a way, almost ostentatiously. You said one of them looked like a film set, and then you referenced the Godard, and it completely, it's almost like Gregory Crutzen kind of work at a certain point. It really does produce a kind of theatricality. So I'm starting with you guys.
Okay. I think maybe before answering that, just a quick observation. Andy talked about 1787 being the year of the registration of the patent of the panorama. I also know that 1787 was the year that the Potemkin village happened. So that's the year when Empress Catherine sailed down the river and erected these facades as the Potemkin city. So for me, it's kind of fascinating that one year that two opposite spatial paradigms, that one is completely immersive and the other is completely skin deep, happened at the same time, one in Edinburgh and the other in Crimea. Maybe at that time it was like the opposite ends of the world. But I think today we live in a much closer time where opposite paradigms could happen at the same time. I think about the 60s. Certainly there were architects who were looking at archigram, were looking for a future, looking at Yellow Submarine. There's certainly architects at the same time looking back at history. There was the Venturi and the Rossis. There was Cope happening at the same time. So I was thinking of when Sanford mentioned about architects who were trained in the 90s, who were completely immersed in this maybe more singular way of thinking about digital design and digital architecture. And I'm thinking about where we are now. Why are certain generations or certain generation of architects that are interested in history or precedent? And maybe, I think that maybe it's not about the pendulum swinging back, but what's happening now is just a continuation of what's happening in the 90s. maybe it's just more compressed in the 90s, but we are accepting that the digital revolution has happened, and how can we incorporate meaning and typology and history at the same time? You know, so this is something the presentations had triggered this thought in me. I think in terms of the subject and having different points of view, I mean, also thinking about Daniel's work of seeing it from as a social political critique. And I think in many ways, as architects, we don't have a lot of control over the type of projects. I think we would like to have more control. So I think no matter what, a lot of our projects are the product of neoliberal economy, you know. When we brought Livia Corona in, I think she has a much deeper project of interested in gerontology, interested in aging, what's happening to the social fabric of Venice. I don't know how much the architecture can address that. You know, I would like to self-aggrandize and think, you know, the building could, you know, but I think there's a history of where architects are overestimated, and there's a history of architects where they're underestimated. And I think for us, it's to relinquish that and let an artist or someone else come in and provide or provoke that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think, you know, today we didn't present our work in the traditional way that we showed buildings and talked about our point of view in a way. We talked about it from other points of view. And I think as a method of working, what that has, I mean, this kind of project started very early in our practice. And I think it has been sort of folded into a method of work. So it isn't, it's not, I mean, I think ultimately we're the authors of these projects, but I think it's this kind of looking outward to come back in and be the author has been generative of a kind of way of thinking about buildings and cities. There's a kind of interest in the generic, let's say, and the way that the building and the city can exist together, that there's a kind of openness in the architecture, even sometimes an underdetermination to the way we think about making buildings that somehow has come out of this kind of collaboration of kind of tossing back the work to another author and seeing it back again through their lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand your question, but I'm pretty sure I don't. But eliminating viewpoint, you know, I think in an art context, we would talk about subjectivity, and that's why I'm so interested in the work you guys do, because you force a different viewpoint other than your own to coexist with the physical manifestation of your work. And for me, very simply, this project, it was an attempt to address subjectivity in point of view. And actually what I'm thinking about next is that exact question/problem, which is how do you eliminate viewpoint while addressing a subject matter or topic, or I don't even really know what the thing is yet, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Is this working? It's on. Okay. Not sure if I can answer. Actually, I understand the question, and I don't have any. I can precisely not give you an answer. It's so funny. I mean, it's one of these stupid quotes that I use all the time. It's a Winston Churchill quote, but I kept thinking of when you were presenting, where he says, "We shape our buildings. Thereafter, they shape us." I thought, this is, you know, I always thought that's the role. That's the political dimension of architecture. Like, you can't enact laws to make this happen or that happen. It's that dull bass note, but it stays for a very long time. You don't know exactly how it happens, but you know, it's very interesting. I can say that. So we know the story of, you know, the perspective, and, you know, it's a short distance from the panorama to the panopticon, and this idea of being able to control and organize the world around the privileged point of view, and the reasons why we think that's bad, and the breakdown of that, whether it's cubism or whether it's other kinds of inclusion of other voices. That's one thing. I just realized when you were asking the question that what these were going for was not to have multiple points of view, but to sort of erase it all into a giant, like smear. And I know this was exactly when I was in Detroit somehow. I was doing these like stupid things at first. I was taking, I would have these at Winter, and they'd have this street of like burned buildings. You'd have this kind of gray-white sky and gray-white snow. And it was just like this weird, like black horizon line. And I would just take a photograph. This is like, you just make a little slice of it, look at it really carefully, and then just not with Photoshop, just like stretch it out like this wide. You know, this, I was trying to imagine just a smear of the city. And so it's not an answer, but there was this thought that we ought to see things that way. I mean, maybe it's odd, you know, you mentioned our other interest in, you know, taking care of that problem of building a color field painting and architecture. Finally, this is our others. Maybe it's not that different, that somehow it just becomes a way of reimagining the world as, I don't know, an extreme abstraction. Concrete, but an extreme abstraction.
So I just say, and then Sanford does that. I took the force of it to be precisely not multiple points of view, but erasing the point of view. So the multiple points of view is something that's so familiar to us that it's just a way of talking about the world. It's a way of sort of respecting difference, celebrating difference. People have different points of view. In its extreme form, it, you know, made it 100 mad before. Isn't that right? I've got the right person about the idea if you have all these different points of view, you can get no truth. That is, I think, a problem that follows from different points of view, but it is both a kind of politics and a kind of art in which the question of point of view is made central. So what struck me about Andrew's presentation, and then to try to work the others back, was that the desire to make the question of point of view irrelevant. So that, yes, you know, when you talk about your work, you can talk about there are different points of view, and that obviously is useful for you in making your work, and it comes up, but it's as if showing it in this form kind of dramatizes the difference between a world where the point of view is made primary, and there's a whole kind of politics and ethics and culture that goes with that, and a world where the point of view is made in some sense irrelevant. And in Daniel's work, I think it's actually more blatantly political, because what it means to think, I'm thinking of the Blisner book, which he didn't show today, but I think it works for 45, for the Long Island City book as well. What it means to make the point of view irrelevant, you know, Lukács, who's not been mentioned today, one said of Lenin also, actually, he's now played a large role in today's conversation. So Lukács once said of Lenin, right, that Lenin's great ability, and then Lenin said it then of Marx, was to see something as a whole. So why is that a great ability? The great ability is to see it in such a way that it doesn't really matter where you're standing. What you're seeing is, in some sense, everything. And that is expressible as a kind of humanist ambition to see everything as a whole, but it's expressive also, and I don't mean this at all pejorative, I mean it's going to compliment in sort of Andrew's, you know, mechanistic anti-humanist ambition, which is to see it from a standpoint that no one could see it. It's not that it's exactly makes you more objective, but it makes your own subject position irrelevant. So yeah, what I was taking from it was precisely desire, and the way you put it, it's useful for me to see the antithesis. I think it's a deep kind of theoretical antithesis and a kind of aesthetic one too, between the project of seeing things from lots of different points of view, and the project from seeing things from what is much harder in a certain sense, from no point of view at all. And that's what seems to me at stake. And you know, if you look at the political stakes, I think that has a lot to do with, I mean, it's not an accident that the World period is also the period of the celebration of multiple points of view, of differences without disagreements, of people who see themselves in different ways, and of the demand for us to respect those identities. So obviously, there's something that we're all committed to in that, but it's also been gone arm in arm, hand in hand with the creation of the kind of inequalities that we, i.e. I, started the day talking about in the first place. So it's that compatibility that seems to me there. So I would see, for example, in Andrew's work, a kind of, you know, without it being articulated, a deep kind of critique of that, without having Andrew, I have no idea what your politics are, and you don't make it clear from that, but that the whole project would be a kind of critique of the celebration of multiple points of view. So yeah, I mean, and Stanford, you can go back now, because the monism thing is harder.
Yeah, I know it's hard, but that's what I find it a lot of fun. Let me say this. I have 100 answers to your question because I'm as interested as you are in it. But I have to also say, in order for my answers to be intelligible, I have to first say that your question already embodies a bias, the bias of the subjective position as the foundation of knowledge of the physical world. And I could go on about this because I've been going crazy. I mean, I do a lot of research on it, and I do actual research on it these days. I will just point out a couple of things. Early psychedelic researchers, such as Stanislav Grof, back in the late 50s and the early 1960s, report that under high doses of LSD, when patients are being led through various traumatic experiences as part of the therapeutics that they're undergoing, never, and the word is repeated over and over again, never recall a traumatic experience from their point of view, but always see it from all the points of view of all of the characters, whether they were the sadists or the masochists in those contexts. Now, a lot of that has to do with the understanding that most psychedelic experiences, let's say, they effectuate a certain transformation, if you like, in the organization of the nervous system, for the way it processes information and organizes sensory information. And in the latest models, they see it as a release from what is known as the default mode network. I won't go into it too much, but the default mode network is exactly where the subject is situated. Now, what they now discover, even using virtual reality devices, is that you can basically bypass the default mode network within 15 or 20 seconds of putting on a VR, under certain controlled conditions, for example, provided, but you can basically lose your rootedness in your own, shall we say, let's just say your perception no longer originates in your own body. And this is something that can take place very quickly. Now, over the years, going back to Abraham Laszlo and others, they refer to these things in many, many ways. I'm going to bring it back to your James thing. But that's to say they used to call it peak experiences. They've often referred to them ecstatic experiences. And they usually have to do, the Greeks called it henosis, usually a kind of sense in which one experiences a kind of knowledge based in sensory experience in which you are no longer, if you like, the receiver, but actually also the medium of this experience of knowledge. Now, curiously enough, the earliest example of which is actually William James. I don't know if you know that this guy's, William James's solution to his hatred of Hegel and Hegelism was actually achieved through experiments with laughing gas. There was a book published in, a small little book published in the 1870s that was called The Anaesthetic Revelation. And he became very obsessed with this, et cetera, and he decided, I got to try this laughing gas, because this guy said that you can actually do philosophy with the assistance of laughing gas, precisely because it gave you a point of view to get around your routinized thoughts. He does so. He writes a beautiful paper called On Some Hegelisms, after which he describes exactly what provided the revelation that he found interesting. So to tell you, to say this in a certain way, this takes us into a different realm, but what it really does, it makes us understand, I think, that our relationship to the material world that we shape is an immanent one. And when you say there are certain virtues in dualism, I think they're mostly lazy ones. Also, I think that they don't give us the capacity for penetration, shall we say, or for, if you like, discovering what we sense lies just beyond our access, and which, in fact, really, which is what drives, generally speaking, what drives culture, what drives experiment, et cetera. So, I know that I've reframed this in a most bizarre way, but I think that there's a preponderance now of evidence that suggests that we don't think about subject for example, if that's what you were talking about, or point of view, it all in the right way. That's to say we have a bias that suggests that relativism is a way out, or that there is a pathological state, let's say, or an altered state which gives us access to the world, where in fact it's the other way around. It takes a full few years, 2 years, before the so-called ego is shaped and created. But it takes, as I say, in the laboratories going in Frankfurt, et cetera, it takes barely 15 to 30 seconds for it to be superseded. Now, what we find, in fact, is we have no particular allegiance to it, even though it's frightening when it goes. And you always do come back. Anyway, I think that there's so much we don't know, but there's so much pointing to this other realm of how we might go about experimenting in order to know it. Thanks.
So do we have, anybody want to talk about their acid experiences? I mean, we have, this is not a place for public confession, so I'm not going to talk about mine doing this. Well, I will say this, the minute we get the notion of bias, the minute we get the notion of bias, we get the notion of the subjective back in some way. So thank our panelists.